What is up, guys? It is Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about a mistake that I think is very common in the fantasy football community, and that mistake is going to be fading players who have burned you in previous seasons. So maybe this is something, you do right now, or you have done, or maybe you know someone who does this, but I think it's kind of a very common sentiment where if you draft a player, first, second round, they underperform, get injured, whatever happens, they don't live up to expectations. You'll see people the next year be like, not drafting this player, they burned me, not going back to the well. And I kind of just feel like this is flawed logic. Like, obviously, that player may not be your favorite. You may not be, rooting for that guy to be a Hall of Famer, whatever. But I feel like, just because they had one bad year, you draft them, it didn't go well, it doesn't mean that you should just totally cut them off and no longer look to draft them for fantasy football. Because if we're being honest, right, like if a player underperforms, it's more than likely that their value is going to drop. So it's not like you're spending the same draft capital on that player. And I think you also kind of just set yourself up to miss out on solid values. If you're just so blinded, on the previous season, you're not really living in the present. I just think you're going to miss out. So I'm going to talk about a player that I think a lot of people faded last year for, underperforming in previous seasons. And then I'm going to talk about a few players that I think people are fading this year, but should probably be back in on, because they're going at a much cheaper price. So the first guy, this was very common last offseason. I was a big Joe Mixon fan, but in basically every video I talked about him, there were people in the comments like, not going to get burned again. He's not going to fool me. And obviously, he underperformed in 2019. Then he missed 10 games in the 2020 season. It kind of looked like he was going to repeat 2019. He was okay in terms of points per game, but he had one like boom week thrown in there, which really helped his numbers. So he had burned owners in back to back seasons. It's not great, but when you just look at Joe Mixon as a player heading into the 2021 season, he was lined up for a massive year. You're just looking at the whole situation. He had no competition in that backfield. He was likely going to step into a workhorse role. This offense was going to be much better with Joe Burrow coming back off the ACL. You had Jamar Chase coming in, and you still had people just blindly fading him because they were upset. He didn't perform well in 2019, and then because he got injured in 2020. So, if you faded him, you likely missed out because he finished as the RB7 in points per game and the RB4 in total points. And he absolutely balled out and stayed on the field. So that's kind of what I'm talking about here. Maybe you remember people fading them, maybe you don't. But as someone who makes, fantasy football content, that was a very common theme with Joe Mixon. Like, I'm not falling for this again. When in reality, like, everything changes every year. Every situation is going to be different, so that's something you definitely have to consider. So now let's talk about some players this season where I feel like people are kind of giving these guys the same treatment. And the first player is going to be Christian McCaffrey. I've, seen some people are totally back in on him. They'll take him as like a top 3 pick. But I've seen other people talking about like they wouldn't even take him in the first round. For me, he's my 101. I'm not saying he should be the consensus 101 because I think, everyone has different ways they play fantasy football. Some people don't want to risk the injury, whatever. I think he should be a top 3 pick. The man was incredibly healthy for 6 straight seasons. He's missed significant time over the last 2 years, but I'm just not willing to pass on the clear best fantasy football asset. And so maybe you don't like him as a top 3 pick, but I've also seen people say like, I will not draft Christian McCaffrey. He is injury prone, whatever. Anytime you're saying you will not draft this player, you're just not setting yourself up well. You're missing out on potential value. Like, I'm someone who really dislikes Antonio Gibson this season. Like, I hate him at price, but if Gibson is going to fall 20 spots past ADP, I'm not just going to blindly fade him because I don't like him at price, right? Like, everything changes. You may get a value on a guy. So for me, I've taken Christian McCaffrey as the number 1 the last 2 seasons. Obviously, he's burned me. Those teams haven't done well because he has been injured, and I'm going to do it once again here in 2021 or 2022 because if he balls out, I'm going to have a very solid chance of winning that league. Now, another running back that I think is kind of getting the same treatment, very similar reason here to Christian McCaffrey, it is Saquon Barkley. He's basically being faded for having back-to-back injury-riddled seasons. First one was an ACL, then he was returning off that ACL, and then tweaked an ankle. He's been called injury-prone. People think he may have fallen off. But when Saquon Barkley is healthy, he is an elite running back one for fantasy football. And I'm not going to be fading him for random, like unlucky injuries. The dude was starting to ball out in week 3 and then week 4. And then he's like, after a play, watching something go on down the field, not paying attention, steps on someone's ankle, like tweaks it. That's not his fault. So I think, if you don't love Christian McCaffrey, I'm not going to be fading Saquon for the injuries. But, if you're someone who's like, I don't want to spend a top 3 pick on CMC, you can draft, a similar archetype of player, high upside, some injury issues in the past, but you're getting them at the back end of the second round. I've still seen people say, like, not drafting Saquon, he's a walk-in injury. Another kind of sentiment I see, this is not exactly directly related to the topic of this video, but they'll be like, oh, this player has to prove this to me. Here's the problem. If you're saying Saquon has to prove he's healthy, okay, he goes out, plays 17 games this year, finishes as the RB5. You're not drafting him back into the second round next year. You're drafting him as a top 5 player. So that's the problem here. Like, when you say, like, this guy has to show it to me, it basically means, like, you're not in on them. Same thing with rookies. Like, we're taking them over some proven fantasy options because we know the ceiling is there. And now the last player who I think is kind of being faded a little bit, and it is Trey Lance. And I feel like this one's going a little bit under the radar, but people were very, very hyped about Trey Lance as a rookie. People thought he was going to beat out Jimmy Garoppolo, would play a role, sometime in year 1. And so he was going as like a top 12 quarterback last offseason. And this is, without us even knowing if he was going to be the starter. So people were willing to kind of stash him because of the potential upside. And we didn't even know how he would be used. We didn't know if the Niners would use him heavily in the run game. We didn't know anything. We didn't know that Deebo Samuel would be an absolute stud. And now Trey Lance is basically being drafted in the similar spot to last season. Whereas, I feel like this situation looks 100 times better than last year. We just saw what Jalen Hurts did with bad weapons and rushing upside. The dude was a mid-tier QB1 without playing well and without having a strong offense around him. That is what rushing upside can give you at the quarterback position. You look at Trey Lance, weapons are stacked. George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, a really strong offensive line. And then you look at his rushing usage from last season. The dude had 31 carries in 2.5 games as a starter. That is crazy rushing upside. I think we should all be more in on Trey Lance, and I just feel like I haven't seen the same people pounding the table for him, who were so in on him last year. If you were in on him last year, you should be in, times 500 this year because everything seems so much better. And here's the thing. Obviously, there's some concern that Jimmy Garoppolo is still going to be there. I would be shocked if Jimmy G is the week 1 starter. But once Jimmy G is either traded or released, Trey Lance's value is going to shoot up because we know he has that value locked in. But in my opinion, if we're playing like the risk-reward game here, I think it's very likely that Trey Lance is the starter, but his value may go up like a round or 2 once that news breaks. So I'd rather get ahead of it, draft him now. And I just think people are kind of off on him because he didn't play. Seems kind of a weird situation. I feel like more people should be in on Trey Lance. But that's the general idea for this video. Try not to just blindly fade players just because they haven't performed for you in the past. Like, it's not going to make a difference. You're probably going to be losing out on some potential value. Now, if someone burned you last year and you're like, I don't like the situation, it's very similar, totally fine. Fade them. But if your only reason for fading someone is they didn't perform well last year on my team, I feel like you're kind of missing out. So that's the general idea here. If you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.